was full, casting a cold, silvery glow over the old, isolated college campus. Eli Warren stepped cautiously through the deserted halls of the library, his footsteps echoing in the silence. It was the weekend, and most students had left, for the break, leaving the sprawling building empty. The clock on the wall above read 10:45 p.m., and Eli glanced at it nervously. The night felt heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. He had been here for a week, just long enough to get used to the place. The musty smell of old books, the creaky floorboards that groaned when stepped on, the empty classrooms where the windows creaked in the wind. But it wasn't the campus that made him uneasy. It was the secret he carried with him, the curse that had haunted him for years. Every full moon he transformed into something monstrous, a werewolf. He'd tried everything, meditation, herbs, even hypnosis, but nothing could stop it. The change came on swiftly, and when it did, it overtook him, tearing away his humanity. His senses grew sharper, his body more powerful, and his mind less human. It was a battle every month, fighting to retain control as the beast within him clawed its way to the surface. Tonight he could feel it again, the unmistakable stirring within him. His blood felt hot, his skin itched with the promise of transformation. His fingers twitched, and his heart began to race, thudding painfully in his chest. The sensation was familiar, but that didn't make it any less terrifying. He had no idea how much longer he could keep his grip on his human mind, and he was alone, completely alone, with no one to help him. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. Not this time, he thought. He had to keep it together. The library's basement was his best bet, far from any other students, and it had reinforced steel doors. If he could get there before the transformation took full hold, maybe he could lock himself in and ride out the night in relative safety. But the clock ticked on, and Eli's body began to betray him. His joints ached and his bones cracked, the sound so loud it echoed off the walls. He clutched the edge of a desk for support, gritting his teeth to keep from crying out. Not yet, he thought, panic rising in his chest. He needed to hold on, but it was too late. The change had begun. His skin felt as if it were burning, the muscles beneath stretching and reshaping. His nails elongated into claws, scraping against the wood. His spine arched, and his vision blurred as his body hunched, forced into a grotesque position. He staggered toward the door, gasping for air, the beast within him roaring in fury. His breathing grew shallow, faster. The basement door was within reach, but the agony of his transformation made movement almost impossible. "Please," Eli whispered, his voice a desperate, pained rasp. "Not again." In an instant, the transformation took full hold. His human form was lost to the overwhelming power of the curse. His body towered to nearly 8 feet, his back hunched and furred, a thick coat of black fur covering his monstrous frame. His senses exploded, every smell, every sound amplified to unbearable levels. The scent of the library's dust, the wood polish, the faint tang of ink from the books, they all assaulted his senses. But it was the hunger, the insatiable hunger that made him want to scream. The beast was ravenous. With a guttural growl, Eli collapsed to all fours, his claws tearing into the floorboards. His golden eyes burned with wild intensity, the human, part of his mind desperately clinging to whatever sanity was left. He could feel the edge of his control slipping away. The hunger was growing, and the beast wanted nothing more than to hunt. He closed his eyes for a moment, fighting to suppress the feral instincts, but the sound of footsteps outside the door brought him back to reality. He was not alone. Someone was in the building. His head whipped toward the source of the noise. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as a primal instinct took over. "It's a hunter," he thought. "They're here to kill me." His heart pounded. He had to get out of there. He had to escape before it was too late. He could feel the moon pulling at him, urging him to embrace the hunt. But Eli resisted. Not tonight. Shaking with the effort, he staggered to his feet, the door in front of him still a few steps away. The pounding of his heart filled his ears as he stumbled forward, every inch of his body screaming to let the beast take over. "I can't." His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a door slamming open from down the hallway. Someone was coming, someone who knew he was here. Panic surged in his chest. He had no time to think. Without hesitation, he bolted for the basement door, his powerful legs propelling him forward. His claws scraped along the floor as he ran, his vision swimming in a haze of wild animal instinct. Eli was trapped in a race against time, against the beast inside him, and against whatever horror was lurking on the other side of the door. The basement door groaned as Eli forced it open, barely able to control the surge of power in his body. It was a small, windowless room, cold and empty, except for a few boxes and stacks of old books. He slammed the door shut behind him, locking it with trembling claws, trying to find some semblance of safety. His breath was ragged, each inhalation sharp with panic. The darkness around him seemed to press in, echoing the wild chaos inside his mind. Focus. Eli, focus. He tried to remind himself, though the words felt distant, fading under the roar of his own blood rushing in his ears. The transformation had completed its brutal course, and now the moon's full power surged through him. His body was strong, massive, but the terror that clenched his chest wasn't from the monstrous form he'd taken. It was the fear of losing control. Eli staggered back against a stack of boxes, his claws scraping the rough wooden floor, leaving gouges behind. His golden eyes flickered, darting around the small space. The faintest noises, a creak of the floorboards upstairs, the scuff of shoes on tile. Everything was amplified, every sound an assault on his already overstimulated senses. But the worst was the hunger. His stomach roiled with an insatiable craving, a burning need to tear, to rip, to consume. It was the wolf inside him, the part that made him a danger to anyone around him. A soft sound reached his ears. Footsteps. They were getting closer, not a student. The thought flashed through Eli's mind before he could fully process it. His eyes snapped to the door. Someone knew what he was. Someone had followed him, perhaps lured him into this trap. Eli's body tensed, his muscles coiling in preparation for what came next. Was it a hunter or something worse? A professor, a fellow student who had never left, curious about the strange boy who always seemed to be hiding something, or someone else? The unknown gnawed at him. With a snarl, Eli pushed himself off the wall, his claws dragging down the wood as he moved, slow and deliberate. The wolf within him demanded to know, demanded to hunt, but his human mind fought back. He needed to survive. He needed to control himself. The footsteps continued, slow, deliberate, creeping closer to the basement. Stay calm, stay human. He forced himself to focus, to breathe through the waves of aggression and need. But it wasn't easy. Every instinct screamed at him to attack, to lash out, to claim his prey. His transformation wasn't just physical, it was psychological. He had to maintain control, or else there would be no one left to escape. He would lose himself forever. The door rattled, a whisper of movement from the other side. A voice, low and unfamiliar, muttered something just beyond his hearing. Eli's heart skipped a beat. Was this person a friend, or was he being hunted? With a low growl, Eli backed away from the door, crouching low to the ground, ready for whatever came next. His heightened senses tracked every sound, the slight rustle of clothing, the scent of fear and curiosity mixing with the air. It was all he could focus on. The hunger gnawed at him, urging him to chase. The beast clawed inside, eager to devour, but Eli held tight. The door creaked open slightly. Then, it happened. The faintest glimmer of light cut through the dark, casting the figure outside in sharp contrast. The unmistakable silhouette of a human, their face partially obscured by a hood. Eli's eyes narrowed. A student. He stood there, frozen for a moment, clearly unsure whether to step inside. They had seen something they shouldn't have. A soft, cautious breath escaped their lips as they hesitated, inching closer to the door. Get out of here now. The thought screamed in Eli's mind. The wolf within him surged, but Eli gritted his teeth, his breath ragged with effort. He wouldn't let his curse consume him tonight. But the student stepped forward, and in that instant the door swung wide open. Eli saw the fear in their eyes. A student, alone. They had seen him. They knew. Panic surged through him, but it was too late. The door was open. The student stood in front of him, eyes wide in shock. There was no turning back now. "What are you?" The voice trembled, small and fearful. They had no weapon, just a flashlight shaking in their hand, the beam flickering wildly. Eli's eyes burned gold, his claws aching to snap forward. The hunger, unstoppable, irresistible, coursed through his veins like wildfire. He felt the moon pulling at him, pushing him to chase, to hunt, to tear. But there was still a thread of humanity within him, barely clinging to the edges of his mind. "Please, just go," Eli growled, his voice low and feral. He wanted to warn the student, to protect them from what he had become, but the words were muffled by the howl of the beast inside. His jaw tightened, the snout forming, his teeth sharp and gleaming in the dim light. The student took a step back, and the air between them became charged, thick with terror. They couldn't look away, couldn't look past the raw power that Eli radiated. I won't tell anyone," the student stammered, their voice barely a whisper. "Just don't hurt me." Eli wanted to scream, to lash out, but something held him back, something deep within, the remnants of his humanity. He could barely hold on to it, could feel it slipping away with every breath, every second that passed. There was no more time. The full moon reached its zenith, and Eli felt the last thread of his control snap. His body convulsed as the beast took over, his claws slashing the air in a frenzy. The student screamed, dropping the flashlight, its beam scattering across the room in chaotic patterns. But Eli was already gone, his body a blur as he barreled out the door, his instincts taking control. The library was no longer a place of safety. It had become a hunting ground. The air in the library felt oppressive, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Eli moved through it like a shadow, his senses heightened beyond anything humanly possible. The world around him was a blur of sounds and smells, every detail amplified. The wood of the library's shelves, the dust in the air, the faint rustling of a paper, 1,000 details he'd never have noticed before were all now painfully clear. But all that mattered now was the hunt. The blood pulsed in his ears, the hunger gnawing at him from within. The beast was awake, and it wanted nothing more than to tear and devour. Eli could hear his own breathing, fast and shallow, a constant reminder of the monster he had become. Every step he took was a struggle against the overwhelming pull to lose himself. Focus, gape. He reminded himself, though the thought seemed so far away. His claws scraped against the floor, leaving deep gashes in the wood as he paced restlessly. The moon was high in the sky, its silver light pouring through the cracked windows, casting long shadows across the halls. Eli's golden eyes flickered in the dark, darting from corner to corner. He was no longer in control. He was the beast, the werewolf, and the campus had become his domain. A faint noise, footsteps, echoed from somewhere above. Eli's head snapped up, his ears twitching. The student he had encountered earlier was still in the building. The scent of their fear hung in the air, thick and unmistakable. They're still here. The student must have fled, but not far. They were hiding, waiting for the moon's light to fade, waiting for the nightmare to end. But Eli knew the truth. The nightmare wasn't over until the moon set, and in the meantime, nothing on this campus would be safe. He moved forward, prowling, his breath ragged. Every instinct screamed at him to hunt, to find, to chase. He moved silently, his massive form nearly invisible in the shadows. The student had made the mistake of thinking they could hide, that they could escape. But Eli was no longer just a man. He was a predator, and they were prey. The floorboards groaned as Eli moved deeper into the building. His body was tense, his muscles coiled like a spring ready to snap. Every hallway was a maze of dark corners and empty rooms. Eli's heightened senses took in every detail, every flicker of movement, every echo in the silence. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he approached the library's back exit, his mind racing. Then the unmistakable sound of hurried breathing. A door creaked open at the far end of the hallway. Eli's eyes narrowed. He could smell them, just a hint of their sweat, their fear. It was a small scent, easy to miss, but not for Eli. The student was nearby. The hunter had become the hunted. With a snarl, Eli lunged forward, moving with terrifying speed. His claws scraped against the floor, sending splinters of wood flying as he rounded the corner, his golden eyes scanning the darkened hallway. The student's footsteps were louder now, the sound of panic clear in every hurried step they took. A door slammed shut, and Eli's instincts told him everything he needed to know. They had entered a room. They were cornered. Eli's breath grew heavy as he stalked toward the door, his massive paws clicking on the floor with each step. His claws extended, the sharp tips scraping against the wood as he reached the door, paused just a few feet away. The student was trapped. The moonlight poured through a nearby window, casting a pale glow over the hallway. The air was thick with tension as Eli waited, his heart pounding in his chest. His hands clenched into fists, the claws digging into his own skin. The hunger surged again, stronger than ever. He could almost taste the student's fear. Then, with a growl that vibrated the walls, Eli broke through the door. The room was small, filled with the musty scent of old books and empty chairs. The student was pressed against the far wall, their back arched, eyes wide with terror. The flashlight had fallen to the floor, its beam still casting erratic shadows across the room. They were shaking, clutching at the walls for support, trying to get away. But there was nowhere to run now. The room had no exit. Eli's chest heaved as he stared down at the student. His golden eyes locked with theirs, and for a brief moment, time seemed to freeze. The student's mouth opened in a silent scream, but no sound came out. Fear radiated from them in waves, and Eli could almost hear their heart pounding in their chest. The wolf was in control now, but Eli was still there. He wanted to scream, to break free from the beast's grip, but the sound of his own breath, the hunger, the overwhelming need to kill, it drowned out his thoughts. The student backed away as far as they could, their eyes wide with disbelief, their hands shaking as they lifted them in a futile attempt to shield themselves. They had seen the truth. They knew what he was. Eli murmured a voice. His voice echoed faintly in his mind. It was still him, still the human, part of him that clung to the edges of his shattered mind. Run. The command was clear, but it was too late. Eli's body moved of its own accord, his claws reaching out, instinct taking over. But just as his hand began to close around the student, something snapped in his chest. The transformation was still there, still pulsing through him. But a flicker of his old self, of his human heart, refused to let go. With a roar, he staggered back, his claws scraping the walls as he tried to force the beast back into its cage. Not tonight. The hunger was unbearable, but Eli fought it with everything he had. His body was trembling, his mind slipping further from his control, but he could still feel the last threads of his humanity pulling him back. The student's eyes remained locked on his, filled with terror, but Eli's golden gaze softened just for a moment, as if apologizing for the monster he had become. With a final agonized howl, Eli turned and fled from the room, leaving the student behind. He had to escape. Eli's heart pounded in his chest, his massive body surging through the dark halls of the library with the urgency of a hunted animal. His claws scraped along the floor, his every step echoing through the empty building. His mind was a whirlwind of chaos, a constant tug-of-war between the wolf within and the man who fought desperately for control. His human thoughts were fading quickly, each breath deeper, each second more frantic. The hunger surged through his veins like fire, and the beast clawed at his mind, demanding to be unleashed. But Eli was losing the battle. He could feel himself slipping, his humanity breaking apart with each passing moment. The more the moon's light bathed the campus, the harder it became to hold on. The main exit was just ahead. Freedom. If he could reach the gates, if he could break through the boundary, the woods would be his salvation. The change would end, and he could escape the curse at least until the next full moon. But it seemed so far away, so impossible. His claws dug into the walls as he rounded the corner, heading toward the courtyard. The gates loomed ahead, locked and impenetrable, and his hope withered as he realized there was no way out. They were locked, trapped, the gates. His primal mind screamed for him to turn around, to retreat into the shadows, but the human side of him remained rooted to the spot. The courtyard stretched out before him, the moonlight casting a pale, cold glow on the cracked stone. The place was eerily silent, the calm before the storm. And yet Eli could hear the distant sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching from behind. Someone else was coming, a student. They hadn't left. They had followed him, waited until the full moon's light had consumed him, and now they were coming to finish what they had started. Eli's golden eyes scanned the courtyard, looking for any escape, any place to hide. But the moon had already done its damage, and there was nowhere to run. The beast was too close to the surface. He tried to breathe to steady himself, but it was impossible. His chest heaved, his body a vessel of pure rage and hunger. His senses exploded in every direction. The scent of the student, fear, sweat, confusion, filled his nostrils. And then, more urgently, the scent of the blood. Not now. His mind screamed, but the wolf within didn't care. The beast wasn't waiting for permission, it was in control now. And Eli could do nothing but watch as it took over. The student appeared in the distance, their figure a dark silhouette against the full moon. They were armed, no weapon capable of truly stopping him, but enough to make an attempt. The student's eyes were filled with equal parts fear and determination. They weren't backing down. The hunger surged once more, but this time Eli didn't fight it. He couldn't. He wouldn't be able to control the monster much longer. But deep down, he knew that this was his last chance, his final test. He had to make a choice. Submit completely to the beast or fight back one last time to break free. The student stopped a few feet away, their breath coming in shallow gasps. Their hands were shaking, but their eyes never left his. "Please, don't make me do this," the student whispered, their voice hoarse with terror. Eli's breath came faster, his claws scraping the stone beneath him. The moonlight bathed him in its cold glow, and for a moment he saw himself, not as the beast, but as the young man he used to be. There was a flicker of humanity in his golden eyes, a glimpse of the person he had been before the curse had taken control of his life. A low growl rumbled deep in his throat, but something else followed, something unexpected. A thought, a memory of a life before the curse, before the pain. He remembered being human. His thoughts, blurry as they were, told him he had one final shot. The student's voice trembled. "I don't want to hurt you." Eli's body ached with the urge to strike, but a part of him fought it. Something more than the instinct to kill. He wasn't the monster they saw. Not entirely. Not yet. He took a deep breath and straightened, trying to hold his ground. His mind screamed to give in, but he fought it with every ounce of strength left in him. In that moment, the moon seemed to shine even brighter. Its light was a burning fire that consumed him, and the curse threatened to rip him apart. But Eli stood tall, his claws extended, his muscles taut with the effort of holding on. You have a choice," Eli rasped, his voice low and strained. "You don't have to be the one to end this. Not tonight." The student's eyes were wide, with disbelief. They had no idea what it was like to be him, to be cursed by the moon, to be trapped in this cycle of violence and fear. But Eli wasn't going to make them pay for his pain. The tension in the air was thick, the courtyard heavy, with the weight of a decision that needed to be made. Then the full moon reached its peak. Eli's transformation reached its zenith, and the beast within roared to life. The final remnants of his humanity cracked under the pressure. But just before it was too late, Eli's mind cleared, and in that fleeting moment he made the only choice left. He ran. With a howl that pierced the night, Eli broke free from the courtyard, his massive form charging forward into the darkness. His claws scraped against the stone, the adrenaline fueling his escape. The student's voice called after him, but he didn't turn back. Eli ran for the woods, for freedom, for survival, and for the chance to break the cycle, even if only for one night. The moon began its slow descent, and Eli's once predatory pace softened, his heavy breathing slowing as he reached the outskirts of the campus. The woods loomed ahead, a dark and impenetrable mass of trees and shadows. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt this free. The full moon, now beginning to wane, cast its cold, silvery light across the forest floor, bathing everything in a quiet, eerie glow. The air was thick with the sense of damp earth and wet leaves, but Eli barely noticed. The forest was a familiar refuge. This was where he had gone many times to escape, to retreat into the darkness where his monstrous nature was less of a threat to the world. But this night everything felt different. His transformation had nearly consumed him, and the hunt had nearly become his undoing. His claws still tingled. His body still burned with the aftershocks of the curse, but in his mind a flicker of clarity had remained. Enough for him to resist the hunger, enough for him to run. He slowed, his massive form collapsing against a nearby tree, breath coming in ragged gasps. His golden eyes gleamed in the darkness, still sharp, still feral. But they weren't the eyes of a mindless beast. They were his. Eli's eyes, tired, haunted, but still whole. For a long moment he sat there, hunched against the tree, his body trembling as he regained control over his erratic breathing. His claws, once sharp and deadly, were now simply trembling hands, the tips still stained with blood, his own and that of the student. The student. He hadn't meant for any of this to happen, but the beast inside him, the wolf, had nearly made him a killer, and Eli had barely managed to stop it. He had been so close to losing himself. His thoughts wandered to the student, their fear, their trembling voice. They had seen him at his worst, but he hadn't killed them. Somehow, against all odds, Eli had stopped himself. He hadn't wanted to, but he did. The hunger had been all-consuming, but something inside him still held on, enough to keep him from making a monster of them too. The student had seen too much. Would they tell someone? Would they come after him? Eli didn't know, but the idea of someone knowing, someone chasing him, it made him sick. He wasn't a man anymore, not really. He was a weapon, a curse walking on two legs, one step away from destroying everything in his path. But for tonight he had won. For tonight he was still himself. Eli lifted his head, his sharp eyes scanning the moonlit woods, but there was nothing. Only the rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig in the distance. He had escaped, but he knew that this wasn't over. The curse would return next month and the month after. It always would. His heart sank as the truth hit him. This would never stop. He would never be free. He could run into the woods, hide under the cover of darkness, but the wolf inside him would always find a way to break through. The full moon would always come back. But for now, at least, he was safe. At least he wasn't a monster. Not tonight. Eli pushed himself up, his claws scraping against the rough bark of the tree. He stumbled forward, shaky, unsteady, but determined. The woods were his sanctuary for the moment, and that was enough. The path ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain. Eli's journey was far from over. The moon would rise again and he would have to face the beast once more. But tonight he had taken the first step toward something different, toward a life where he wasn't a slave to the curse, toward a life where maybe, just maybe, he could find peace. The darkness of the woods swallowed him whole as he disappeared into the night, leaving behind the college, the student, and the terror of the full moon. The curse was still there, deep inside him. But Eli wasn't going to let it define him, not anymore. If you enjoyed this story and want more chilling legends and terrifying tales, make sure to like this video. It really helps us out. You can also click on our Ultimate Werewolf playlist to watch more horror and cryptid stories. The link is in the description below. And if you love horror, folklore, and unexplained mysteries, subscribe to the channel and join our growing community of fear seekers. But don't stop there. Turn on notifications by clicking the bell icon so you never miss a new story. Because in the world of horror, the scariest things happen when you least expect them. And trust me, you don't want to be left in the dark. Welcome to the darkness.